Howdy folks, I'm Michael J. Gormley, but y'all can feel free to call me Gorm. I'm an English professor at Quinsigamon Community College in Massachusetts, US, where I'm also the first scholar in residence. My research and teaching focus on tracking in literature, space-time in ecocritical assessments of nature, and nerdy pop culture stuff, especially Star Wars. This paper assembles analyses appearing in my first book, The End of the Anthropocene, Eco-Criticism, the Universal Ecosystem, and the Anthropocene. Using eco-criticism in modern science fiction, I interrogate what it means to be human when living in extraterrestrial environs. The literary readings assess the Anthropocene to characterize the sort of action that will end this epoch and begin the next. If you're interested in the end of the Anthropocene, I have a discount code for you. Hopefully, that helps balance the book promotion that all my presentations have ultimately become. Anyways, thanks for watching. This is Properly Suzerains, or Speaking as Nature, Traditional Ecological Knowledge on Earth and Mars. Simultaneously engaged in planetary-scale ecological impact and preparing crewed missions to Mars, humans are fast approaching the late-stage Anthropocene. We will shortly decide how we handle the climate crisis, and that ecoethic will govern environmental interrelations elsewhere in the universal ecosystem. Reading tracks and trackers in Cormac McCarthy's Southwest and 21st century science fiction frames humans as biotic bodies constituted with and in ecological relations, an apolitical identity for reinsertion into current ontologies to frame an ecoethic for living well with nature. This paper utilizes tracking, the act of witnessing organisms by footprints and sign left while moving within environs, as an ecocritical framework for literary analysis, inculcating a positive ecoethic for the end of the Anthropocene and the epoch beyond. Traditional ecological knowledge from first and indigenous peoples, arguably the first science or a sort of proto-praxis. Tracking realizes ecometonymy, that expression of environment and organism, reciprocally in the characteristics of each. Tracking always, in actual dirt or in literature, describes a biotic body entangled with its environment. This paper positions Blood Meridian's notion of suzerain, a human authority countermanding local judgments, even nature's, against that paradoxical ecocritical ideal that we might speak as nature. Blood Meridian's anthropocentric inevitability is less determined off-planet, and this analysis invokes Andy Weir's The Martian to argue that biotic relations with Mars can abide a positive ecoethic. Whatever that ecoethic, it persists beyond the Anthropocene and frames the Anthropocene, that next epoch when we are no longer mandatorily bound to the blue planet on which we evolved. On the ecocritical axiom that we might speak a word for, but not as nature, Lawrence Buell concludes that, quote, although there is something noble about human attempts to speak ecocentrically against human dominationism, unless one proceeds very cautiously, there soon becomes something quixotic and presumptuous about it, unquote. Buell also differentiates ecocriticism from gender studies and critical race theory. The naturalist does not speak as nature, where one can speak as a woman, as a transgendered person, as a person of color. Roiling in ecocriticism is the paradoxical ability to manifest the anthroposphere or caretake the planet, and the inability to be nature. This paper looks to tracking as a process toward the ardent and total integration with one's biotic home required to approach speaking as nature, be it on a blue or red planet. Tracking is a powerful ecocritical motif and locus, functioning identically in fiction and reality to describe biotic relations. Maintaining ecocritical process to read actual nature in fiction eschews the mythological perspective of tracking. Think Tolkien's Aragorn or McMurtry's famous shoes. And the mystifying insight of fictional trackers is simply tracking. Tracks issue the absolute existence of an organism, a knowledge inextricable from human evolution. In Born to Run, Christopher McDougall details that pre-Stone Age humans deployed tracking as the critical means of hunting herd animals for consistent large sources of protein. Human physiology contains equipment needed only by running animals, thus describing a long-distance runner capable of persistence hunting, chasing an animal to death. A human at a jogging pace forces a prey animal to sprint without sufficient rest, hyperthermically killing it. Humans developed this hunting method as the last ice age ends and the forests recede. The newly opened plains are a perfect environment for chasing an animal for miles. The trouble with any strong runner just going out and chasing down an animal is the tendency of prey to become indistinguishable from the herd or environment. When persistence hunting, the Kalahari Bushmen, quote, look at piles of dung and distinguish which droppings come from which animal. Intestines have ridges and grooves that leave unique patterns on feces. Learn to tell them apart, and you can single out a zebra from an exploding herd and track it for days, unquote. There are two broad types of evidence left by an organism in the landscape, tracks and sign. The former is the print on the ground, while sign tracking examines evidence in the wider landscape, that space above the track. More than identifying direction of travel, size and maturity, and when the track was made, tracking reads micro-expressions that detail the organism's internal state. Tracker and naturalist Tom Brown Jr. explains that these pressure releases, quote, tell if an animal's belly is full or empty or partially filled. We can see indicators of thirst or injury. We can also see diseases, for the body also reacts to disease through compensating movements. Each track tells us everything about that animal, its actions, reactions, its condition, whether it is full or hungry, thirsty or tired, healthy or sick, unquote. Each track contains in its contours rich descriptions of body position and movement, while also detailing shockingly nuanced internal circumstances. With experience in the context of a larger section of track line, trackers realize the full physiological state of the being. The depth of a track describes the fullness of belly or an injured ankle, information determining an animal's motivations and where it next moved. Granular buildup along the track's ridges register head position, indicating everything from casual interest to hint of a mate, prey, or predator, or the full intention to travel that direction. Degree of buildup on the track wall describes the scenario, even through footwear. A track is a precise description of an organism in that moment. Reading tracks is witnessing that biotic being. Further, the presence of an animal metonymically indicates ecology, the presence of its food sources, its predators, terrain types, and climate. Understanding the needs of an organism locates that organism in its biotic context. Tracking an organism contextualizes that being in the total interrelations of its ecosystem, accessing biotic identity. Moving above the track, sign tracking realizes the animal in its environment and, quote, involves finding the elements of a landscape that, when combined, make up the foundation for abundant animal life. A rich variety of vegetation, the availability of thick cover so that an animal feels secure that it can escape its enemies and raise its young. And finally, but not always necessarily, the presence of water. Unquote. The act of tracking a being is always an examination of its ecosystem. Thus, tracks function metonymically, standing for and expressing the being who made them in response to their immediate environmental circumstance. Tracks state that an organism must exist, and that organism states that other organisms exist, that water sources and shelter exist. Tracks are ecometonymies, standing for the biotic interactions of organisms and their environs, prioritizing identities formed in interrelated nature. In the penultimate confrontation of Blood Meridian, the kid, fully integrated with the landscape through tracking, refuses the opportunity offered by nature to kill the judge. While drinking from a natural seep, the kid is fired upon by the judge, who has now acquired horses and rifles. Opposite the judge's equipment-based survival, the kid entrenches himself in the biotic identity of the natural watering hole. The kid continuously maneuvers into, through, and out of the creek, mirroring wolf in action amid the tracks of these apex predators routed by westward expansion. The kid's vision is hyper-attuned to the tracks and the water for the entire confrontation, and his biotic relation to the landscape manifests opposite the judge's anthropos. As the kid belly crawls against the judge, he sees ants enacting the perfect biotic version of caravanning through the desert, having already succeeded at the water source where humans somehow fail. The ants then secure themselves and secure the biotic cycling of the biome by the dead livestock of failing human caravans. His eyes then, quote, met the eyes of a small viper coiled under a flap of hide, unquote. With an awareness and gaze preceding the kid's reciprocal recognition, the pit viper ecocritically embodies and narratively foreshadows how the kid gains predatory advantage over the judge. Entrenched in the biotic community and landscape, neither the ants nor rattlesnake alter their activity for the kid, as his physical action and presence biotically respond to and secure the ecosystem. The judge's horses reveal the kid by watching him emerge from the water. As the kid cocks his pistol, quote, they pricked their ears and began to walk toward him across the sand, unquote. The horses are attuned to the environment and approach the violent precursor of a drawn hammer. A horse must grow accustomed and learn these sounds signify a purpose and security granted the animal by humans. The kid kills these extensions of the judge, of Anthropos. The judge demands compensation for his property, and the biotic kid is unmoved. He is hardly the first thing to kill livestock brought to this creek, as all desert water, quote, was marked by the carcasses of perished animals in increasing number, as if the wells were ringed about by some hazard lethal to creatures, unquote. The hazard is the biotic cycling of a teeming biome. The lethality of the place strikes surest those oppositely entrenched in Anthropos. The lethality of wolves and rattlesnakes that detail the very life of the place is not visited upon the kid. The kid acts against the judge and perpetuates the creek's biotic cycling. The kid, as tracker, is fully opposite the judge and indecipherable from the landscape. At the creek, he was ingrained in the environment by his tracking. As he and the ex-priest walk, the kid notices that their track line is being taken by the wind, naturally brushed out and made identical to all other stretches of desert. Titled "The Wind Takes a Side," the scene offers affirmation of the kid's tracking action as access to the biotic world. With this knowledge, the pair hides from the judge and the kid makes his and our mistake. Misunderstanding his relationship to the total environment, the kid does not kill the judge. Hidden in and as nature, the kid mistakenly uses his predatory advantage to evade the judge, instead of acting as nature and killing him. He and Tobin wait among bones, quote, sated scavengers, unquote. The judge is an excellent tracker and is still confounded by this dissipation. The judge never tracks for his own biotic integration, instead seeking to dismantle nature's power over human life. He argues that, quote, only nature can enslave man, and only when the existence of each last entity is routed out and made to stand naked before him will he be properly suzerain of the earth. Unquote. His landscape-based tether is severed by the abiotic circumstances rapidly decaying the track line. The wind, nature, took a side. Ecocritically, the kid accesses his immediate and potential relations to the environment by recognizing the dissolution of his tracks and gains an advantage the judge cannot penetrate. Nature has already demonstrated this exact scene for the kid when he and the judge were with the Glanton gang. A bear suddenly rises out of a mountain forest as they pass. This unseen bear was eating carrion, and, upon standing, the horses spook and the gang fires. Casually, the bear plucks one of the Delaware off his horse and plods off into the woods with the man in his mouth. For 3 days the gang tracks not the bear itself, but the blood and sign of the Delaware carcass the bear carries, never finding either, for, quote, like some fabled storybook beast, the land had swallowed them up beyond all ransom and reprieve, unquote. The kid can be that bear, an agent of nature consuming that which would consume the wild. The kid does not kill the judge, does not act biotically against the judge, incorrectly reciprocating onto the judge instead of the environment the boon the young rattlesnake gave the kid in letting him pass. The rattlesnake recognizes an apex predator entrenched in biotic action. As it would not strike a passing wolf or bear, the rattlesnake takes no issue with the kid. Every time a rattlesnake uses its venom in self-defense, it goes without a meal. The kid acts as the rattlesnake did, but fails to embody, to think as the rattlesnake, which will forego hunting to kill something threatening its life. The kid's current circumstance is that he and the landscape are under threat by the very presence of the judge. Able to leave the desert, the judge ushers in the Anthropocene, that epic constructed by things cleaving humans and nature, contronymically separating and binding. Capital, globalization, crafted hyperobjects, and the rest of the anthroposphere used to simulate independence from nature, but integrate through the biotic cycling of extinction. The kid, in some delirium, sees truly the judge overseeing, quote, an artisan, a worker in metal, a cold forger, who worked with hammer and die, perhaps under some indictment, and an exile from men's fire, hammering out like his own conjectural destiny, all through the night of his becoming some coinage for a dawn that would not be. It is this false moneyer with his gravers and burons who seeks favor with the judge, and he is at contriving from some cold slag brute in the crucible a face that will pass, an image that will render this residual species current in the markets where men barter. Of this is the judge. He is the judge of doubles, who are alike enough their true and preceding other to act as thoroughly, but in systemic deterioration instead of maintenance. In the Anthropocene, we are doubled forgeries of ourselves as we attempt to live as creatures integrated with an ecosystem that no longer exists. Residing in the kids in action is our consent to prioritize human bodies over the biotic system that evolved them, ushering in the epical ecology that doubled us with ourselves. We made ourselves forgeries of the beings that maintained the ecosystem by maintaining themselves and their kin. We now maintain that categorical forgery of the non-biotic human. We left alive a man, a philosophy that promotes the notion that, quote, whatever in creation exists without my knowledge exists without my consent, unquote. In this philosophy and motive, the judge, in one of the several violences propagating his authority, kills and stuffs birds in an act reminiscent of preparations for a gluttonous feast that never comes, for it would at least reference some biotic and seasonal relation that the judge acts against. Instead, manifesting a non-predatory, non-biotic form of consumption, because he cannot currently conjure the twisted zoo to house all birds to extinguish the flight offending his suzerainty. Without illusion, the judge acts for Anthropos. We are properly staged to continue as the judge would have us at the end of the Anthropocene and on into the Astropocene, that next epoch of human integration with extraterrestrial environs. In Blood Meridian, there is a meteorite that has, quote, wandered for what millennia from what unreckonable corner of the universe, unquote, to collide with the Earth's surface. There it remains, adopted as anvil and expressing a universal ecosystem that constitutes a good place for humans to settle without shifting the contours of those environs. The judge hauls the slag above his head and hurls it a distance beyond all gamblers' reckoning, winning the random wager and gathering to himself alone the literal and figurative human capital of such a feat. The judge does not tolerate the universe arranging itself without his input, without his own perpetuation. This is how we might interact with the wilds beyond our planet, impacting the natural contours of the universal ecosystem for personal capital, regarding the universe's wilds as we have those of our biotic home. Turning to Andy Weir's The Martian, we gather a text describing a biotic human existing with and in an extraterrestrial planetary environment. Wonderfully, tracking works equally well on the Red Planet. Only when tracking Watney in the landscape do earthbound humans approach the Martian environs and experience Watney's biotic circumstance. Tracks ecometonymy describe the precise organism in its environment anywhere that a track can be made. While NASA does not examine tracks until late in the novel, Watney is thoroughly entrenched in biotic interrelation with the Red Planet, keenly imbibing the baseline Martian terrain, understanding the rate at which normal Martian weather causes track degradation and total erosion. Following his own tracks until he loses them brings him back to local terrain and familiar landmarks by which he navigates home. Watney's tracking knowledge is absorbed through attention to the ecological baseline by living within, becoming an excellent Martian tracker. After the novel's final storm, NASA reads tracks in the Martian dirt to access Watney by his biotic ties. Looking at the images of Watney's flipped rover, Mindy, the one who discovered Watney was alive and now tasked with positioning satellites to constantly track him, explains, quote, the weather's clear. If he'd come out, there'd be visible footsteps. There are ordinary wheel tracks. She pointed to a large disturbance in the soil. Judging by where that ditch is, I'd say the rover rolled and slid from there. You can see the trench it left behind. The trailer flipped forward onto its roof, unquote. Mitch, head of the Jet Propulsion Lab, adds that the rover is intact for, quote, if there'd been a pressure loss, there'd be a starburst pattern in the sand, unquote. This is as close as NASA gets to seeing Watney without him exiting the vehicle, inside of which he or his life support may be irreparably damaged. Mindy and Mitch describe what the Martian's third-person limited omniscient narration grants the reader in the prior chapter. Tracking Watney grants the novel's earthbound characters access to the same narrative omniscience as the reader. Watney models an entrance into the universal ecosystem that is biotic, pre- and superseding political existence. An ecoethic that can emerge from a politicized present, utilize its tools, and yet maintain its priority of non-destructive relation to the nature that precedes our arrival. Watney's earthly body biotically relating to Mars inspires a positive global human politic. Watney, back on Earth, reflects on his survival and rescue. Quote, Part of it might be what I represent: progress, science, and the interplanetary future we've dreamed of for centuries. But really, they saved me because every human being has a basic instinct to help each other out." Unquote. Watney and Weir make a biological social argument that models the recirculation of the biotic human concept into the late-stage Anthropocene. Our grip on these apolitical moments is tenuous, if at all constant. Likely, the apolitical human is but a spark that flashes into and out of existence with an identical rapidity. Treated as nature narrative, Watney is just such an ember, exemplifying a biotic human diverging from the destructive imbalance of the Anthropocene. Biotic identity must be invoked to institute an apolitical self, which then reissues ontology and an ecoethic for the end of the Anthropocene and on into the Astropocene. The synonymity of tracks and organisms makes them indistinguishable ecometonymies. Built into tracking is a certain objectivity, a distance from concepts more abstract than organisms in ecosystems. As that is our very dilemma, deploying tracking as an ecocritical framework becomes quite timely and universal. Witnessing a track briefly accesses an apolitical organism in that moment relating to the immediate biotic circumstances of the environment. Recognizing the ecometonymic expression of organisms prioritizes the immediate and authentic biotic home of an organism. Ecocriticism's desire to derive and inform necessary human relations in fiction and nature is furthered. So we might identify and capitalize on moments in which we can end this epic and begin the next as organisms who live and die well together. Thank you.